7 years ago, my life changed completely. I'm a 32-year-old man who was disowned by my family over a false accusation from my cousin, Jenny. She claimed I had sexually assaulted her, and without hesitation, my entire family turned their backs on me. At the time, I lost everything: my wife, my reputation, and the people I thought would always stand by me. My wife left me immediately, but thanks to a prenup, I didn't lose any money. My parents, 2 brothers, and 3 sisters all believed Jenny without questioning her story, even though it didn't add up. The only people who stood by me were my uncle and aunt, Jenny's own parents. They had doubts because her story kept changing, and they had solid evidence proving I couldn't have been where she claimed the assault happened. Despite their efforts to clear my name, my family refused to listen. Looking back, I've come to realize that my uncle and aunt became my true family that day. They defended me while my biological family replaced me with Jenny. The pain of being abandoned by everyone else was indescribable. The police were never involved because Jenny claimed I had connections that would protect me. That lie actually spared me from legal trouble, but it left me feeling helpless to clear my name in any official capacity. My friends, however, knew the truth. They had evidence that I was at work during the dates Jenny mentioned. Their support kept me going. As for my family, they blocked me on all platforms and refused to speak to me. My aunt told me they chose to keep the accusation private, likely because airing it online would expose Jenny's lies. My parents essentially adopted Jenny, treating her as their own daughter. She became their priority, while I was erased from their lives. It was a devastating time, but with the support of my uncle, aunt, and close friends, I began rebuilding my life. Little did I know, my family's choices to side with Jenny would come back to haunt them years later. After being disowned, I had to start over completely. Thankfully, I was already prepared for a fresh start. I had just graduated college, and my trust fund, which had covered my education, was already in my account. I moved to a new city far from my hometown, started a job as an editor at a popular magazine, and began piecing my life back together. Meanwhile, Jenny settled comfortably into my place in the family. My parents moved out of their master bedroom to give it to her, showering her with every luxury she demanded. My siblings, 2 brothers, Jack and Daniel, and 3 sisters, Haley, Diane, and Priscilla, also chipped in financially to support Jenny, a decision that wrecked their lives in ways they didn't yet realize. Jack, 30M, had to take out a second mortgage on his house to keep giving money to Jenny, and it was putting serious strain on his marriage. Daniel, 24M, went deep into debt, borrowing hundreds of thousands of dollars to fund Jenny's lifestyle. Haley, 26F, and Diane, 28F, dipped into money meant for their kids' birthdays and holidays to keep up with Jenny's demands, causing serious friction with their husbands. Priscilla, 22F, refused to go to college, despite her excellent grades, just so she could stay close to Jenny and help her. She ended up working long hours at a fast food job with no real plan for her future. Jenny, for her part, had no job, no education, and no intention of changing. She spent her days lounging around my parents' house, binge-watching shows and snacking. My aunt once told me that my parents dipped into their retirement savings for Jenny, leaving them with barely a quarter of what they'd saved. Despite the chaos, I had no contact with my former family. They had blocked me everywhere: phone, social media, you name it. The only updates I got were from my aunt, who still kept tabs on them. My uncle and aunt apologized to me repeatedly for Jenny's actions. They were devastated by the harm she caused, but I assured them they had nothing to feel guilty about. They had done everything possible to defend me, and for that, I was eternally grateful. They became my real parents, the family I could rely on. While my former family coddled Jenny, I built a life I could be proud of. Holidays were spent with my aunt and uncle, who refused to associate with my parents. My career flourished, and I found a sense of peace, even though the betrayal still stung. But the drama wasn't over. 7 years later, the truth would come out, and everything my family had sacrificed for Jenny would unravel in a way none of us could have imagined. 7 years later, my life had settled into a comfortable rhythm. With a thriving career as an editor, a peaceful home, and an unshakable bond with my aunt and uncle, I had left the shadows of my past behind. My former family? Just a distant memory. Occasionally, my aunt would update me on their lives, but I always dismissed the news. It wasn't my world anymore. But yesterday, everything changed. My aunt called me out of the blue. Her voice was different, serious, urgent. "The truth is out," she said. I almost dropped my phone. "What truth?" "Jenny confessed," she replied, her tone heavy with the weight of what she was about to say. Apparently, Jenny had celebrated her birthday with my former family in my old home. As always, it was a grand affair, funded by the sacrifices of my siblings and parents. Gifts piled high, expensive food, and alcohol flowed freely. Jenny, ever the self-proclaimed queen, indulged far too much in the latter. That's when it happened. Fueled by alcohol and perhaps the burden of maintaining her lies, Jenny admitted everything in front of everyone. She confessed that her accusation against me had been fabricated from start to finish. "I lied because I was jealous," she had slurred. "I hated how he had everything handed to him. I wanted it all for myself." The room reportedly went silent. My mom, my dad, my siblings, everyone froze as Jenny detailed how she had manipulated them into disowning me. She'd played the victim, knowing they'd believe her without question, and used their guilt to milk them dry for years. The fallout was immediate. My parents, horrified, kicked her out of the house on the spot. My siblings erupted in fury, realizing they'd thrown away their own futures to support a fraud. Years of debt, failed marriages, and lost opportunities, all because of Jenny's lies. "They're devastated," my aunt told me. "They don't know how to handle it. They want to contact you, to beg for your forgiveness, but they don't know how to reach you. They're asking me for your number." I was stunned. After years of silence and estrangement, my family wanted me back. "Because of this? What did you tell them?" I asked. "I told them it's not my decision to make. You've built a new life, and you don't owe them anything. But they're desperate, and they'll keep pushing if you let them." I sat there, the phone cold in my hand. Part of me wanted to laugh, to celebrate the fact that the truth had finally come out. But another part of me was angry that it had taken this long, angry at how easily they discarded me, and angry that they thought an apology would fix everything. "They made their bed," I said quietly. "Let them lie in it." As I hung up, I realized the ball was in my court. The bridges they burned were ashes now, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to rebuild them. For 7 years, I had lived without them. The question was, did I really need them now? After the call with my aunt, I couldn't shake the weight of what had happened to my former family. The fallout from Jenny's lies had devastated their lives, and now they were facing the consequences of their blind trust. My parents were financially ruined. They'd drained their savings and even tapped into their retirement funds to support Jenny. Now, only a fraction of their retirement was left, and they had no plan for recovery. Jack, my older brother, had taken out a second mortgage to fund Jenny's lifestyle. His marriage was on the brink of collapse, his wife was furious and threatening divorce over his misplaced priorities. Daniel, my younger brother, was buried under debt. Loans he took out for Jenny's compensation fund had left him in the hole for hundreds of thousands, money he'd never be able to pay back. Haley and Diane, my sisters, had sacrificed their kids' futures for Jenny. Funds meant for their children's birthdays and school supplies were handed over to her. Their husbands were furious, and both marriages were on the verge of divorce. Priscilla, my youngest sister, had thrown away her future. She'd turned down college to work a low-paying job just to stay close to Jenny. My aunt feared she'd regret this decision for the rest of her life. And Jenny? She was now homeless, abandoned by the family she'd manipulated. My aunt told me Jenny had tried to contact other relatives, but no one wanted anything to do with her anymore. It was a bitter irony. The family that had discarded me to protect Jenny had sacrificed everything for her, only to be betrayed in the end. And now, they wanted me back, to fix what they had broken, to forgive them. But could I? My aunt's words kept echoing in my mind. They made their choices, and now they have to live with the consequences. For years, I had rebuilt my life without them. I had a new family, one that had stood by me when it mattered most. Did I really want to risk opening old wounds by letting them back in? I wasn't sure, but I knew one thing: I didn't feel sorry for them. Not yet. Not after everything they'd put me through. The days following my aunt's call were a whirlwind of emotions. On one hand, I felt vindicated. The truth was out, and my former family was paying the price for their blind trust in Jenny. On the other, their suffering was unsettling, though they had brought it on themselves. My aunt kept me updated on the fallout. The family dynamic had completely unraveled. My parents, once the glue holding everything together, were now struggling. Their home was nearly empty, their finances drained from supporting Jenny. They had sold off assets to cover her expenses, and their retirement was nearly gone. My mom, once the emotional anchor, was reportedly inconsolable, and my dad, always the stoic patriarch, had broken down multiple times when talking to my aunt. Jack was in even worse shape. His wife finally served him divorce papers, citing his financial support of Jenny as the cause. Jack was now fighting to keep his home and see his kids, all while battling the weight of a second mortgage. He was barely holding it together. Daniel was buried in debt. Unable to keep up with the interest, he was selling off his belongings to make payments. The carefree brother I'd once known was now a man overwhelmed by stress. Haley and Diane were also struggling. Their marriages were crumbling under the strain of funneling money meant for their children to Jenny. My aunt said their relationships were on the edge of collapse, as their husbands were furious over their sacrifices for Jenny. Priscilla, my youngest sister, had given up her dreams for Jenny. Now, stuck in a dead-end job, she seemed lost and regretful, unsure how to reconcile her sacrifices with the truth about Jenny's lies. The more I heard, the less sympathy I felt. They had chosen Jenny over me, and now they were paying the price. A small part of me, though, still felt sad for what could have been. The collapse was rapid. Jenny, once elevated to near sainthood, was now a pariah. My siblings, who had once supported her, were now fractured and bitter, blaming each other. No one was taking responsibility for their role in this mess. Jenny had disappeared after her confession. My aunt said she was kicked out, and though she tried reaching out to other relatives, word of her lies had spread, and no one wanted anything to do with her. It felt almost poetic. They had disowned me for a liar, and now they were reaping what they sowed. But could I really just close the door on them? I wasn't sure. Part of me wanted to confront them, to see the regret in their eyes and hear their apologies. Another part of me wanted nothing to do with them. I had built a new life, free from their toxicity. Did I really want to risk reopening old wounds? For now, I decided to do nothing. My aunt reminded me that I owed them nothing, that I had every right to continue my life without them. But the weight of the decision hung over me, and I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. The weight of the situation was crushing. While part of me felt vindicated by my former family's downfall, another part couldn't ignore the years of love and shared memories. These were the people who had once celebrated my successes and supported me during difficult times, but they had also abandoned me at my lowest, siding with lies without hesitation. I spent days contemplating my next move. My aunt repeatedly reminded me I owed them nothing. "You've built a new life," she said. "You don't need their apologies to keep moving forward." But their suffering wasn't just emotional, it was financial and personal. Jack had lost his marriage and was struggling to keep his home. Daniel's debt was spiraling out of control. Haley and Diane's marriages were teetering on the brink. And Priscilla, who had always been closest to me, was stuck in a dead-end job after sacrificing her future for Jenny. My parents, once the proud heads of the family, were broken. They had sacrificed everything for Jenny and were left with shattered finances and overwhelming guilt. My mom cried whenever my name was mentioned, and my dad had aged years in just a few months. Despite their pain, I couldn't shake the memory of their betrayal. They had abandoned me when I needed them most, believing Jenny's lies and refusing to listen to reason. My uncle and aunt, who had become my new family, insisted I owed them nothing. They made their choice, my uncle said. You've done fine without them. But the decision wasn't simple. I couldn't forget the years we had spent together, the birthdays and holidays we had shared. They had been my family, and now they were desperate to reconnect. The real question was, could I trust them again? Even if I forgave them, could they truly change, or would history repeat itself? Then, messages began flooding in. Friends and distant relatives reached out, delivering heartfelt pleas from my parents and siblings. They begged for forgiveness, for a chance to make amends. One message from my mom read, "We were wrong, and we'll do whatever it takes to make things right." The sincerity was clear, but I couldn't ignore the nagging thought that they only wanted me back because they were desperate. Jenny had drained them financially, and now they were scrambling for help. Was their regret genuine, or born out of need? I threw myself into my work, seeking solace in editing projects, while my uncle and aunt reminded me I had no obligation to reopen old wounds. As the days passed, the weight of my decision only grew heavier. My aunt kept me updated on my former family's bleak reality. Jenny, now the family pariah, was couch-surfing between friends and distant relatives after being kicked out of my parents' home. She had gone from golden child to black sheep. My parents, meanwhile, were struggling to rebuild their lives. They had burned through their savings and were now facing financial ruin. My mother, devastated, cried daily over the choices they had made and the son they had lost. My father, once the stoic provider, had withered under the weight of his guilt. Jack, fighting to stay afloat after his divorce, was barely keeping up with the financial burdens he'd taken on. Daniel was drowning in debt, and Haley and Diane's marriages were hanging by a thread. Priscilla, the sister who had sacrificed everything for Jenny, remained stuck in a dead-end job, her potential all but wasted. Despite all of this, my aunt insisted I owed them nothing. They made their bed, she reminded me. They need to lie in it. You don't have to fix what they broke. But the messages from my family kept coming. Friends I hadn't heard from in years relayed their apologies. The most difficult to ignore were my mother's. One message from her read, "Please, son, I know we were wrong. Our love for Jenny blinded us, but we've paid the price. All we want is to make things right. We miss you more than words can say." My father's message was shorter but equally poignant, "I failed you. I don't expect forgiveness, but I'm sorry. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make amends." The sincerity was clear, but so was the pain their betrayal had caused me. I wondered if their regret stemmed from genuine remorse for the harm they had caused, or if it was a reaction to their current struggle. As my aunt and uncle continued to support me, urging me to leave the past behind, the memories of my childhood, of love and laughter, grew harder to ignore. Could I really move forward without hearing them out? Or was their remorse too little, too late? The decision was tearing me apart. Reconnecting meant reopening old wounds and risking more hurt. Staying away might leave me with a lifetime of unanswered questions. For the first time in years, I was unsure of my path forward, caught between the life I had built and the family I had left behind. As I wrestled with my decision, updates about Jenny's collapse provided a stark contrast to the once enviable life she had built through lies. The princess of our family was now facing the brutal consequences of her actions. After being kicked out, Jenny struggled to find her footing. The lavish lifestyle she had enjoyed, funded by my family's sacrifices, vanished overnight. Her friends, tired of her freeloading and manipulative behavior, began to distance themselves. With no work experience or education to fall back on, she found herself in limbo, bitter and desperate. My aunt overheard a conversation between Jenny and my mother. Desperate, Jenny had called, pleading to return home. "You owe me," she screamed. "I did everything for this family, and now you're abandoning me?" For the first time in years, my mother found her voice. "You destroyed this family," she replied coldly. "You ruined lives with your lies, and now you want sympathy? You're on your own." I felt a fleeting moment of pity for Jenny. Her greed and envy had consumed her, and now she was paying the price. But that pity was short-lived. She had orchestrated the destruction of my relationships, and nearly derailed my life. Any lingering guilt I felt was drowned out by the memories of the years I had spent rebuilding from the wreckage she had caused. The consequences of her lies continued to unfold. My former siblings, already struggling financially, now had to contend with the emotional fallout of Jenny's betrayal. Haley and Diane, once her strongest defenders, were now vocal about their anger. "She used us," Diane reportedly told my aunt. "She used all of us, and we were too blind to see it." Jack and Daniel were less vocal, but their bitterness was palpable. Jack's marriage had officially ended, his wife unable to forgive the financial strain caused by his unwavering loyalty to Jenny. Daniel had begun selling off personal belongings to keep up with his crushing debt, even parting with his car in favor of biking to work. Priscilla remained quiet, but my aunt speculated that she was beginning to reconsider her choices. "She's still there," my aunt said, "but I think she's starting to see the cracks in Jenny's facade. Maybe this will be her wake-up call." Through all of this, my former parents were unraveling. My father, once the unshakable pillar of our family, was visibly broken. My mother, consumed by guilt, was suffering both emotionally and physically, her health reportedly declining under the weight of her decisions. My aunt, trying to protect me from the worst of it, reminded me often, "You don't need to feel responsible for any of this. They made their choices, and now they're facing the consequences." Still, despite her reassurances, I couldn't shake the sense of responsibility that lingered. They were still my family, even if they had abandoned me. Their suffering tugged at my heartstrings, and I hated that it did. Jenny's fall from grace was a cautionary tale. It underscored the fragility of trust and the devastating impact of lies. Watching from the sidelines, I wondered if this was karma or simply the tragic unraveling of a family that had failed to see the truth until it was too late. Jenny's downfall was not just the loss of privileges, it was the unraveling of the very fabric of the family. My mother, in particular, had been hit hardest. She had clung to the belief that Jenny was a victim, that her actions were somehow justified. But when the truth came to light, the cold reality was harder to face than any accusation could have been. The guilt consumed her. I heard from my aunt that my mother had been crying every day, overwhelmed by the weight of her role in believing Jenny over me. "She can't stop blaming herself," my aunt said during one of our talks. "She's starting to realize how badly she screwed things up." My father, once the pillar of strength in the family, retreated into himself. He had always been more reserved, but now he was almost unrecognizable. The man who had once been the protector of our family was now a shell, lost and broken. He stopped taking care of himself, stopped engaging with anyone, and isolated himself further. It wasn't just the financial loss, my aunt said, it was the emotional toll that had truly destroyed him. As for Jenny, the walls had closed in. From being the golden child, the family's darling, she had become the pariah. The house that had once revolved around her now stood as a monument to her manipulative grip. My aunt shared that Jenny's attempts to worm her way back into the family's good graces were met with cold indifference. No one trusted her anymore. The damage was beyond repair. The most heartbreaking fallout, however, was between my siblings. Jack's divorce had been finalized, and his financial troubles had left him scrambling to make sense of his life. He had poured all his resources into supporting Jenny, and now he was left with nothing but debt and a broken heart. His ex-wife, unable to forgive the strain he had placed on their family, moved in with her relatives, leaving Jack to face the aftermath alone. Daniel, meanwhile, was drowning in debt. My aunt told me he was still trying to pay off the loans he'd taken out for Jenny, but he couldn't even begin to make a dent in the amounts. His future had slipped through his fingers. His dream of owning a home or starting a family seemed impossible now. Haley and Diane's marriages were hanging by a thread. Their husbands couldn't understand how they had prioritized Jenny over their own children. The strained relationships were now reflected in their crumbling marriages. Divorce seemed imminent, a bitter end to years of devotion to a lie. Priscilla's situation was the most painful. She had sacrificed everything for Jenny, her future, her education, and her potential, only to be left in a dead-end job, trapped in a life that wasn't her own. My aunt was convinced that if Priscilla didn't change course soon, she would lose any chance of making something of herself. Throughout all of this, my aunt kept reassuring me, "None of this is your fault. They made their choices." Still, I couldn't shake the guilt. Watching my family fall apart, torn apart by the web of lies that Jenny had spun, made me question everything. Was there anything I could have done differently? Should I have fought harder to stay in touch, to prove the truth before it was too late? But even as these doubts crept in, I knew in my heart that distancing myself had been the right choice. They had chosen to believe Jenny, turning their backs on me when I needed them the most. No amount of guilt could change the fact that they had allowed themselves to be manipulated. Now, all I could do was move forward. I had my own life to rebuild, my own path to walk. I couldn't afford to let their mistakes define me. Jenny's fall from grace was just the beginning of the fallout. It was time for me to take back control of my future. The calls from my family kept coming, each more desperate than the last. But every time I saw their names on the caller ID, I let it ring. There was nothing they could say that would undo the past. There was nothing they could do to bring back the family I once knew. I had a new family now. My aunt and uncle had stood by me through it all, and they were the ones I considered family. And as much as my former family wanted me back, I knew deep down they were no longer my responsibility. The healing, if it ever came, would have to come from within them. They had to live with the choices they made. And me? I was moving forward. My former family's repeated pleas for forgiveness, each one more desperate than the last, only served to make their actions feel more burdensome. They wanted me back, but what was left to rebuild? The trust they had shattered couldn't simply be restored with apologies or promises. Jenny's lies had torn apart everything I once knew, and the fallout was undeniable. Yet, as I watched the chaos unfold around them, there was a strange sense of relief. I had walked away from their turmoil, and for the first time in years, I felt in control of my own life again. But even amidst that relief, the questions never fully left: could I give them a chance? Should I let them atone for what they had done to me? Was opening that door worth the risk of it all falling apart again? The answer became clearer as I thought about it. Forgiveness wasn't something I owed them, not anymore. They made their choices 7 years ago, and those choices had left deep scars. Their mistakes had broken the bond we once had, and no quick fix, no matter how sincere their apologies, could repair the damage. In contrast, my aunt and uncle had become the true family I had always longed for. They had stood by me when no one else did. They fought for me when I couldn't fight for myself. With them, I had found a sense of belonging I'd never known with my biological family. The holidays were now spent with them, and those moments, filled with laughter, support, and love, were more meaningful than any time I had ever shared with the family I once had. One evening, as I was winding down after a long day at work, the call came. My ex-mother asked if I would be willing to speak with them. I stared at the phone, knowing this was the moment I had been avoiding for so long, the moment I would finally have to make my final decision. I picked up the phone and dialed my aunt, needing her guidance. "They're still reaching out," I said, my voice shaking. "I don't know if I can do it. I don't think I can pretend like nothing happened." My aunt's voice was steady and clear. "You don't have to forgive them. You don't owe them anything. If they truly wanted to make things right, they would have stood by you when it mattered. The people who love you, who truly care about you, are right here. You've built a life for yourself, and it's not your job to fix theirs." Her words felt like a lifeline. They resonated in my mind long after I hung up the phone. I had spent years wondering if I could find it in myself to forgive, to let go of the past. But now, it was clear. Forgiveness wasn't something I owed them, it was something they needed to earn. And I couldn't keep sacrificing my peace for their comfort. So, I made the decision. I deleted their messages and blocked their numbers. It was harsh, but it was necessary. I had to protect myself. My life was moving forward, and there was no space for the past to drag me backward. For the first time, I truly felt free. I had the support of the people who mattered most to me, and that was all I needed. I wasn't going to spend another moment wondering what could have been. It was time to stop holding on to a family that no longer existed and start focusing on the future. My journey was far from over, and I was ready to walk it, not with the weight of the past dragging me down, but with the love and strength of the family I had built around me. The future was mine to shape. And I was ready.